Well, with all due respect, certain things need to be clarified with regards to statements made by Elder Ephraim of Arizona in his book, My Elder Joseph the Hesychast. And he's got a section in there about the old counters, about the Zealots. And Father Ephraim claims that Elder Joseph stated that the Zealots are planemeni, meaning that they are in delusion or deceived. And this is a very general statement, and it's problematic for Father Joseph himself, if he really made this statement, because just a day before that, Elder Joseph was himself a zealot. So it creates a Gordian knot, and there's a reason why Elder Joseph was a zealot, was because he discovered that the righteous fathers on the holy mountain of Athos who had progressed in prayer, who knew something about the hesychastic life, who knew something about the power of the Jesus prayer, were themselves zealot fathers. Those fathers themselves are actually mentioned by name in this book. For example, Elder Kalinikos, the Hesychast. Elder Kalinikos was a practitioner of the Jesus prayer, and he was a true Hesychast. He lived in Katunakia, in the desert region of Mount Athos. And he was, if anyone would be called a Hesychast, he was the Hesychast of the time. He was the Hesychast. And he was a zealot, and I would say that he was probably one of the stricter type of the zealots, because the zealots were divided into two factions. The old counters were either Matthewites or Florinites. Of course, at this time, Matthew himself was not ordained bishop, but the difference between the two was that the Matthewites were the ultra-conservatives who believed that the new counters all were graceless from 1924 onwards. And the Florinites were called Florinites because they were the followers of Metropolitan Chrysostomos, formerly the Bishop of Florina, who stated that you can't really come up with such conclusions so fast. But Elder Kalinikos was of the stricter faction. He believed that the new calendars were graceless. In fact, there's a famous quote that is referenced to him. Apparently, he said that the new calendar baptism is a bath and not a baptism. And of course, for us, that sounds very extreme, especially at that time. But anyhow, he was a holy man, a God-bearer, really, and someone who really understood the power of the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. So much so that his mind was so illumined that at the time of heresy, he was ready to defend the Orthodox Church. There was another holy elder that's mentioned there, Elder Daniel, who belonged to the Megisti Lavra, the monastery of Great Lavra, but he wasn't a monk of the monastery. He was a monk in one of the Kelya, one of the cells, and he was a hesychast. He would pray the liturgies, and Elder Joseph and Elder Arsenius would go to these liturgies, and they called those liturgies of Elder Daniel a mistagogia. It was a grace-filled event, and it was just, they would be saturated from the holiness coming from this holy elder who would pray the divine liturgy, and then he would say a few words after the divine liturgy, and then he'd go and do his hesychastic business. This Elder Daniel was also, as we said, a zealot. And these were the two most influential elders at the beginning of Elder Joseph's poria, his path in this hesychastic life. So Elder Joseph himself was aligned with these fathers who believed that the new calendars were graceless. But then he started getting thoughts, and he prayed about things. Apparently, it says there in the life he prayed, and then they left the stricter faction to join the synod of Metropolitan Chrysostomos, Saint Chrysostomos of Florina, who was a righteous man of God, and he had heard about that. And he wrote a letter to him asking for forgiveness, and Metropolitan Chrysostomos wrote back to him and said, all is fine, and I accept you all. And then he had another vision, and then he left Metropolitan Chrysostomos and decided to leave the Zealots altogether. And then eventually he started commemorating the patriarch, and then eventually his synodia went back and forth. One thing is consistent, and the one consistent thing is that there's a lot of inconsistencies with regards to what is going on here because of this Gordian knot that I'm talking about, which is actually confusing. Most people that read this book can't really read behind the lines. They just read this statement and they think, oh, well, Elder Joseph said it, so that's the end of the story. Well, these other holy fathers did not believe that. There's another elder mentioned in this book, Elder Hieronymus of Aegina. Elder Hieronymus was an exceptional man of prayer. He had compunctionate prayer. He had the prayer of the heart. And the situation with Elder Hieronymus was actually the opposite. Elder Hieronymus continued to serve under the so-called official churches after the change of the calendar, but he was having conscience pangs about it. And he prayed and he prayed. And then God made it clear to him that he should join the Zealots. So he went on to Metropolitan Chrysostomos of Florida. And then he continued with the synod. And the bishop that buried him was Metropolitan Akakios of the Evlia. He's one of our bishops. He's still alive. He's in his 90s. And Elder Hieronymus had a greater gift of clairvoyance than Elder Joseph. It's pretty evident from his life and from those people that knew him. And even foreknowledge, because they're two different things. Sometimes God reveals certain things. Sometimes God does not reveal certain things. Like what St. Macarius of Egypt says in his ascetical homilies. He says that even the disciples of our Lord themselves weren't exactly able to work miracles every single time that they wanted to, because that was up to God. God's the one that works miracles. So Saint Hieronymus met with Elder Arsenius, the co-ascetic of Elder Joseph, before Father Arsenius met Elder Joseph in the Holy Land at the monastery of St. John the Baptist in the Jordan. And so Elder Arsenius learned a few things about prayer from Elder Hieronymus, and he had a very, very high opinion of Elder Hieronymus. Finally, the nun who was with Elder Hieronymus and stayed with him up to his death is the sister, according to the flesh, of Father Arsenius. There was another contemporary of Elder Hieronymus whose name was Elder John of Amphiali. He was the founder of the monastery of Saint Demetrius in Piraeus, and also of the Holy Trinity in Amphiali. This man literally raised the dead. He was a miracle worker, both during his life and after his life. And one time he went to visit Elder Hieronymus, and Elder Hieronymus said, "Please leave." So this was a shock to Sister Evpraxia, the nun who was with the elder, and she said to Elder Hieronymus, "How could you do such a thing? How can you ask Father John to leave? This is the Father John." And Elder Hieronymus said, "Nun, believe me, I did not see a human being. All I could see was an effulgence of light. And that man is a saint of God, and I'm not worthy to hear his confession. And I'm not worthy to be in his presence." And this Saint John of Amphiali, whom we consider a saint because he is a saint, was the confessor of Saint Chrysostomos, Metropolitan Chrysostomos of Florida. And it was revealed to Father John of Amphiali that Metropolitan Chrysostomos was going to repose. And so he went to see the bishop, and he told him about his revelation. And the Metropolitan said, "I had the same revelation." And so the one confessed to the other one, he took Holy Communion, and he reposed he had a righteous ending. So these are the people now who were under Metropolitan Chrysostomos. And so on the one hand, he's praising Elder Hieronymus, but on the other hand, they're considering Metropolitan Chrysostomos to be, I guess, schismatic. They don't come out and say schismatic. They don't use that word. In any case, I think that's the conclusion that a lot of people can get from reading this book. There were a series of books written in Greek by Father Cherubim, Father Cherubim, called Contemporary Ascetics and Monathos. These books were translated and printed by the St. Herman of Alaska Monastery in Platina. They're really good lives, very edifying, particularly for monastics. One of the lives comes to mind, Father Joachim, who was one of the fathers of the St. Anne's Skete. He was a zealot father, meaning he was a non-commemorator. He belonged to the Synodia, which didn't commemorate the Patriarch of Constantinople for matters of faith, as many fathers at the time did. And he was in America, And he was scandalized by the fact that many of the modernistic clergy in America cut their hair, trimmed their beards, or shaved their beards, and wouldn't wear a raso. So he prayed to the Mother God that he be deemed worthy to always wear his raso to his last breath, and to have long hair and to have a long beard. So here we see a very unique phenomenon. His beard grew down to the floor, and he used to carry it in a sack. There's a photograph of him in the life. And once again, he also was one of those fathers that did not commemorate the Patriarch of Constantinople. You know, we could write volumes and volumes about these other old calendar elders. There's also Elder Moses of Athikia. He's just an absolutely phenomenal person who, I mean, this is just, the details of his life are unbelievable. He reposed in the 1940s. Elder Euronymous, I think it was 66. They were all contemporaries. Then, just a few years before Elder Joseph's repose, he received an encyclical. Now, this was the thing that really prompted this move to leave the Zealots. He received an encyclical from the Genuine Orthodox Christians of Greece, the Synod of Metropolitan Chrysostomos, stating that the official, so-called official New Calendar Church of Greece was graceless. And he thought, wait a second now. We came here so that we don't have to deal with all that. And of course, even here, there's one encyclical, there's another encyclical. It's not exactly clear. It was a prospathia. It was an endeavor to bring together all the old calendars, the two factions. Metropolitan Chrysostomos didn't totally believe that they were graceless. He made that a statement so that he could bring the other faction together. So, Elder Joseph was upset. He was quite irritated over this encyclical. So he said, Fathers, now reading in the life, it seems like he already made up his mind, but he says, Fathers, we need to pray. So he went in and closed himself in his cell and prayed for 3 days. And then he came out and said, Fathers, we're leaving. So they didn't all accept it very easily. In fact, the older fathers had a problem with it. Father Arsenius, he had a problem with Patriarch Athenagoras. The younger ones had no problem, Father Ephraim, Father Joseph, Father Harambos. But Father Ephraim himself, Father Ephraim of Katonaikia, another Father Ephraim, who was not exactly part of the Synodia, but who had Elder Joseph as a spiritual father, said something very significant to him that's recorded in this life. And he said, Yarda, Elder, you know that even the chosen, even the elect, can fall into delusion in the last days. Well, of course, even in the first centuries of the church, the elect were always faced with the problem of demons appearing as angels of light. So you see, this is very, very, it's sort of a danger zone when we're dealing with dreams, particularly dreams and visions and voices. I'm not saying that it doesn't happen, because if I say that, then we might as well just cut out a lot of the lives of the saints, the details from the lives of the saints, because you find this, obviously. But the fathers, even some of those fathers themselves who had these visions, did say that one has to be very cautious. St. John of Lattice says, don't accept any dreams. It could be, and I'm not saying that Elder Joseph was Planimenos himself, that he was totally in delusion, but it could be that there was a delusion here or there that happens. But now we're continuing with the inconsistencies, because on the one hand, we read in this life the dream that he had at that time, and in another life, I think it was Father Joseph of Dionysio, who wrote the life of Elder Ephraim of Katonaikia, something different. In this life, it says that Elder Joseph had a dream that he was in church and they were bickering among themselves. And he says, yes, they're all in the church, but they had no elefthero pneuma, a spirit of freedom, a free spirit. And so, of course, you can come to the conclusion, perhaps, that they're all part of the church, but that the Zealot fathers are too busy bickering, so that you don't want to be with them because you're not going to have a free spirit. On the other hand, the book written by this Father Joseph says something different. It says that Elder Joseph found himself on piece of land that was separated from the holy mountain of Athos, and then he jumped off and went onto the mainland for safety. And then after he jumped off, that little piece of land fell into the sea. So it's there's no reference to this at all in this book written by Father Ephraim, but I think I've heard like 3 or 4 different types of visions about this. Another thing about worms or something. So we have a little bit of, or perhaps a lot of inconsistency. And then after this, one wonders why he didn't just have the one vision and go straight to the patriarch. Why leave the Matthewites, go to the Floronites, and then stop commemorating, and then after that, commemorate the patriarch? Because when they left the Zealot fathers, they didn't start commemorating the patriarch right away. There was a period where they didn't commemorate him either. Then they started commemorating the patriarch, and then at the lifting of the anathemas, which happened after the repose of Elder Joseph, the Synodia themselves stopped commemorating. And at that time, although they didn't align themselves with the Zealots again, they were just non-commemorators, which there are still some of those types, I think, on Mount Athos. They aren't exactly with the Zealots, aren't exactly with the Old Counters, but they don't commemorate. And Father Ephraim of Katunakia, then, at this time, when Elder Joseph decided to leave the Zealots, protested a little bit, and Elder Joseph said, if you've got a problem, go back to your elder. So you see, he belonged to another synodia, but he felt a close connection to Elder Joseph. He was almost part of the synodia in a way, because he felt like Elder Joseph was his spiritual father. But then since he felt so closely connected to Elder Joseph, he had a problem of conscience. They're not with the Zealots, and they started commemorating. And I'm here with the Zealots. What do I do? So he prayed about it too. And then he asked a couple of elders. I think one of them was Father Gabriel of Dionysio, and I think the other one was Father Gerasimus Mikrayananitis. He's the hymnographer. He was a famous hymnographer. And they said, stay with your elder. So for many years after that, Father Ephraim of Katunakia remained a zealot. He stayed with his elder. And now this is very strange, because in the book written by Father Joseph, they're praising him for that because of his obedience. But we know that obedience to disobedience is not obedience. If you believe that that's not the church, you need to be with the church. No elder is above the church. And there's a very clear chain that I'm always talking about, right? On the top is our Lord himself, because he's the head of the church. Then there's the body, the church. Then we have the synod. After the synod, we have the bishop. Then we have the priest, and then we have the deacon and the monastics and the lay people, and so on and so forth. So what we have this chain. But if there's a disconnect somewhere in between Jesus Christ, the church, and you have to make sure that you connect with the church. So he's saying there, Father Joseph saying in his book, that he was honoring the church by staying with his elder because of the teaching of the church of obedience. Now, of course, the church teaches obedience. This is why Adam fell from paradise, because of his disobedience. And our Lord came to us by his obedience. And, we have a lot of people who aren't really thinking like Orthodox Christians. They try to reshape Orthodoxy because they're affected by Protestant thought, perhaps. And they try to underestimate the chain that we're talking about. You have to have a spiritual father. You have to have a bishop. You have to have a synod. You have to have a church. You have to be obedient. If you're obedient to your father, you're obedient to Christ. Yes, that's true, and we don't deny that. But if your father is not connected to the church, you got a problem. You have to connect with the church. And another time we hear that Father Ephraim of Katunakia heard a voice saying the church is in Constantinople. But on the other hand, he's continuing to commemorate. So this is really a Gordian knot, like I said. But people don't really know, and they can't make these connections, and they can't read in between the lines. So Father Ephraim says that when Elder Joseph made his move, it was apotoma, it was a sudden change. So that's why some of the older fathers particularly, were a little surprised with his decision. I can sympathize to a certain degree with Elder Joseph's frustration with some of the Zealot fathers, because some of the Zealot fathers did, in fact, have zeal not according to knowledge. Some of them were a little too fanatical. But to be fair, that happens everywhere. The New Calendars themselves have fanatics, both those who are ecumenists, those who are anti-ecumenists. You're going to find fanaticism everywhere. It just happens to be a problem. But you can't base your opinions upon one or two or three or four people. It has to be based upon the truth. So we mentioned our saints, our own elders, which Elder Joseph himself had a connection to in some way, to some of them. I know that Father Ephraim, I mentioned that there was some inconsistency going on. I know that at one time, as we said, when they lifted, at the lifting of the anathemas, they stopped commemorating. At one time, he went to visit Archbishop Maxentius. Someone told me that Archbishop Maxentius read a prayer of Kerothesia over him. Another time, then he went back. They all started commemorating the patriarch when they became abbots of monasteries. Then, I think it was 91 or 92, Father Ephraim decided to join the roll corps. Then a few months after that, he left. And of course, there was, people were saying that Panagia told him to go to the roll corps. He left after that. So, did Panagia make a mistake or what exactly is going on? I don't know. But I know that they were during this period when they left the Zealots, but also when they were not commemorating the patriarch, that they were very much sympathetic towards the Russian Orthodox Church abroad. The Russian Orthodox Church abroad, rather, is where we got our ordinations from. And the Russian Orthodox Church abroad is the church that supported the traditionalist Orthodox. And there's another bishop, Nikolai Velimirovich, who used to provide Holy Chrism for the old calendars of Greece. St. John Maximovich, the patron of our holy monastery, visited my cathedral, the Cathedral of St. Michaela, on numerous occasions. He was up on the throne during services, and there are pictures of him at the cathedral. St. Metropolitan Philaret, and the roll corps produced a lot of holy people. Well, these were our bishops, and here in America, of course, we have a very close connection to them. And in 1969, Metropolitan Philaret wrote, together with his entire synod, a letter to our synod in Greece, officially proclaiming a recognition, recognizing them as a sister church. They were aware of what happened. They were aware of the persecution against the old calendars after 1924, when the calendar changed. And, oftentimes when God needs to, he makes things clearer to the flock of Christ for one reason or another. In 1925, the old calendars decided that they were going to have a visual service for the Feast of the Cross at the Church of St. John the Theologian, and it became a huge event. It wasn't just 10, 20, 30 people. It turned out to be 2,000 people. The authorities heard about it, and they sent the police to stop the vigil. And the police arrived there around 11:30, and once they saw the multitude of people looking up to the sky, they looked up to the sky and they saw the sign of the cross over the church as a verification to the faithful who are celebrating, according to the Orthodox calendar, the feast of the exaltation of the cross. Now, when you read, you can find two other instances of this taking place in the history of the church in the Minan. It's commemorated in the Minan. This is the third time. And this is a big event. We're not talking about a yaya or a papu, grandmother or grandfather, babushka, dedushka, whatever you want to call them, having some type of a dream, or, one or two people seeing something. We're talking about 2,000 people. God doesn't make mistakes. And those people remain faithful to the traditions of the church. There was no such miracle among the new calendars verifying their mistake. But after that, it was one thing after another, too. But this was a major event because there were 2,000 people. And as I said, even the police themselves fell on their knees, beseeching the Lord for mercy. So there was no way that they were going to arrest the priest and cause a ruckus there at that service. So we are called Talogika Provata. We are called the rational flock of Christ. So we're supposed to use our mind. And this is abundantly clear, I think, to anybody who's rational. So you can't be making statements like the old calendars are all planameni, because I think that the miracle of the cross taking place speaks a lot more than one or two people making such blank statements. Another instance of one of the many miracles which took place, because as I said, there were many miracles which took place in order to verify for those who were trying to preserve their Orthodox faith and tradition that they were doing the right thing by following Metropolitan Chrysostomos. There were times when clergy were invisible, or people in general were invisible. And I've heard this even from people who are commemorators today, clergy who will commemorate the Patriarchate, because some of them were zealots at one point. It was an undeniable fact for them that there were times when the police would go to arrest people and the people were just not visible. And one of those times was Father John of Amphiadi. He was in church in the sanctuary and the police went to arrest him and he was right there. And if you've ever been to the church, I went to the church that he founded of St. Demetrius, the sanctuary is very small. And the police went in and they didn't see him at all. Other times they would be chanting and they wouldn't hear the chanting. So God was working definitely with these people. God was with these people. From then on, there were numerous different miracles which took place. I remember one of the monasteries that I went to in Attiki, in Attica, in honor of the Zalolopigi, the life-giving spring. The elder there, his name was Father Theokritos, he was young, and then there were nuns that were there. He was hiding in the mountains during the time of the persecution of the old calendars, because the old calendars clergy would be imprisoned, their beards would be shaved, they would take off their rasos. Sometimes we hear of horrific events of turning over the Holy Communion chalice, other times of toppling over the epitafios on Holy Friday. And so the nuns were in church mourning the fact that they had no priest for the Feast of the Theophany to bless the waters. And while they were in church and saying their prayers in tears, right underneath the icon of the life-giving spring, the marble cracked open and water came out. Of course, they understood that this water was holy water. And I didn't mention also for St. John. Remember, I mentioned to you about Elder John of Amphiali? After his repose, he was buried at the Monastery of Holy Trinity that he founded. And every year, on the monastery feast day, the bishop would go and have a memorial service at his grave. And once they started the memorial service, water would come out of his grave, and the faithful would collect it. And I know people that witnessed it many times, and the miracles would happen from this water that came out of the grave of Father John. Then, of course, the relics came out, and after the relics came out, the miracle stopped. By God's grace, we have a rib of St. John at our monastery, and also relics of St. Hieronymus and of St. Chrysostomos. So it's not so simple. You can't just say, if you know anything about history, you can't really just say that the old calendars are schismatics, especially if you have any connection with Elder Joseph the Hesychast, because his whole upbringing, what can we call it, his whole formation as a Hesychast was with the Zealot Fathers. It was only in the last few years of his life that he left. And perhaps this is one of the reasons why the New Calendar Patriarch has not officially glorified him, whereas he's glorified others like Father Paisios, who was recently reposed, I think, in 1994. I said glorify, I mean, official proclamation. But the real issue, of course, the most problematic issue is when you're dealing with matters of faith, you believe what your bishop believes. So if your bishop is preaching some type of a heresy, you're believing him. You can't just say, well, the bishop's the bishop and he can do whatever he wants. And that's his business. And I believe what I believe. Because on top of the holy table, we have the antimension, which is signed by the bishop, which gives permission to the priest to serve the divine liturgy. And the divine liturgy takes place in his name. The priest is his representative, really. This is the teaching of St. Ignatius the Governor and the fathers of the church. And we can bring to reference many statements made by a lot of these bishops, which are extremely problematic because they're not really orthodox statements. And perhaps we can save that for another time. So I hope that answers your question.